Hi everyone, and welcome to a midweek special of On the Whistle. Now, as I've been doing for the last couple of weeks, I want to try and take the opportunity when we haven't got a midweek game to take a bit of a deeper dive into a Sunderland topic and hopefully give you folks some insight that you'll find interesting. Thanks so much for the really kind feedback on the couple I've done so far, and hopefully you'll find this one interesting as well. And the topic this week is recruitment, and more specifically, how does Sunderland actually sign a player? What does that process look like in 2025? What are they looking for? And how do they go about actually getting it over the line? And this is a topic, I guess it's kind of been inspired by a couple of things I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks. One was very obviously watching Kira Louis-Dreyfus be interviewed on Monday Night Football and talk about the prospect of the January window and kind of hinting, I think, that Sunderland are going to be quite proactive and look to strengthen. Clearly, it's not going to be on the same scale as the summer. But more specifically, it was inspired by a conversation I had with Régis Lebris at the press conference before the Everton game, when I'd wanted to ask him about the way that Sunderland recruit players, not just in terms of their technical ability and their attributes on the pitch, because I think, to be honest, in 2025, the amount of video analysis that's out there, the amount of data that's available to clubs, it's probably never been easier to assess what a player's going to bring you on the pitch. Much harder is to assess what they're going to be like off the pitch. And I've been thinking about this topic mainly because of a couple of performances really that I'd seen in the weeks previous from Luciano Gatroida. The first one was that cameo off the bench against Wolves. He plays a really important part in the winning goal. Sets Shemsdean Talby away, makes the run up the pitch, which takes a couple of defenders out of the game. And noticing that he was pretty much the first player to celebrate in front of the Roker end and the passion of his celebrations. And then fast forward in a week, kind of a similar story really on his first start at Chelsea. Plays a big part in that goal with that incredible run up the pitch. And then again, pretty much the first player to celebrate with the fans at the end. And I just love that because this is a guy who is on loan, so he's not Sunderland's player. He's probably had a frustrating first few weeks at the club where his last few years he's been pretty much been playing exclusively top-level European football, experienced international. He's come into what on paper, should be a relegation battle. Can't get in the team, but there's no sense of frustration or letting his head drop. Just really kind of clearly driving the standards, taking really seriously the responsibility of coming on late in games. And it just kind of struck me how much Sunderland have managed to sign, not just good players this summer, but players who actually really buy into the club's philosophy and the mentality of the dressing room, which I think it's kind of incredible that Sunderland have managed to keep that going from last season, having signed so many players. And of course, it's not just Gatroida. I think Nori Mukela is a brilliant example of that. The energy he brings, the drive he's got, the enthusiasm, which he's kind of got stuck into this Sunderland project, despite the fact he was playing for PSG, the best team in the world, not so long ago. And Lebris was really interesting talking about that because, listen, there's obvious ways that you can try and find out more about a player and what they're like. You can speak to your connections in the game. You might be able to speak to a coach who's worked with them before. Maybe you can speak to a former teammate who's played with them before. What Lebris said was that one of the things he actually does in addition to that is when he's watching a player, of course, he's looking for their attributes. What are they good at? What can they bring on the pitch? But he's also watching their behaviours. How do they respond in certain situations? Whether that's an error from a teammate, whether that's when your team goes behind, how do they respond to that? How do they respond to when they have a difficult moment in the game? Trying to assess their behaviours and how they kind of respond to that and the clues that gives them as to what kind of character they're signing. Great example of this would be Noah Steaky on Monday night. He had a really difficult half hour, probably his worst performance to date in a Sunderland shirt, but rebounded really strongly, kind of recovered from a moment where I think we were all a bit nervous after that yellow card that he picked up out of frustration, and had a brilliant second half. And that was the kind of things that there's no science to it and you can't guarantee it, but the things that Sunderland are trying to work out when they sign these characters. And I think that was something that was really interesting to me and kind of sparked this kind of broader topic, if you like. So let's take it back to the start and how Sunderland actually signed a player. So the first thing to say is that the key to any club when it comes to recruitment is being really well prepared, but also really agile, because deals can happen after months of preparation or they can happen in days. This summer, a great example of that. You saw how quickly Sunderland were ready to move after selling Joe Bellingham to Dortmund, Habib Diarra and Noah Siddiqui, Shemsdean Talby, big deals that Sunderland were clearly ready to move on very quickly. And that's because they had done so much preparation, establishing the players who they thought they would try and sign if they won promotion at the Premier League, specifically in that first phase, targeting high potential players who they felt that could be successful at Premier League, but more at the point, have a really sort of big long-term potential for the club, both in terms of their room to develop further, but also obviously their resale value. We can't get away from the fact that in 2025 in recruitment, in modern football with PSR, that's absolutely massive. So you could see that those were players that Sunderland had already done a lot of background work on. And then there are examples throw it forward to the end of the window with Bertrand Traore, almost the complete opposite of that. Sunderland are in negotiations with Ajax to sign Brian Broby, and it becomes apparent that Traore is available because Ajax probably need to raise some extra funds for their own transfer business and their own kind of financial regulations with UEFA and Dutch football. And with Sunderland realising that it's probably likely that Patrick Roberts is going to depart, they explore that deal, they take a look at the player, Premier League experience, international captain, what he can bring to the dressing room, the additional cover he can bring on in that part of the pitch, and they decide to go and do it. That deal gets completed with literally minutes to spare on deadline day, and the whole thing from start to finish takes about 2 days. So there's no like one exact way that a transfer works, and you know the contrast in terms of the time and the level can be really of preparation can be really different. But the fundamental kind of process, I guess, is kind of similar. So the starting point for this is that, and this isn't exceptional to Sunderland, I'm not suggesting this is something that Sunderland do exceptionally. This would be the case of any Premier League club, but it is something that's changed over the last few years at Sunderland as they become more and more professional and they become more and more elite, if you like, in their operating. You know, recruitment is very much a 12-month process. All the way around the year, Sunderland have dedicated staff who are scouting. And one of the things that having a bit of stability on and off the pitch is that you can have a good idea of what you want your team to look like and therefore what a good Sunderland player looks like, if that makes sense. So I know this sounds slightly incongruous when Sunderland have played with the back five in the last 2 games, but generally speaking, Sunderland like to play in a 4-3-3. They want to have a young squad. They want to have really high energy players because that's the style that they want to play. And so that allows them from, you know, a weekly basis, really, when they're looking at players, when the recruitment staff are going about their work, to have a real clear profile for what they want players to look like. And so they will just constantly be monitoring those players. A lot of work will be done getting actually out on the road. There is a lot of video analysis and a lot of data is a massive part of it. But traditional scouting, you know, if there's a perception out there that doesn't still happen, that's completely wrong. You know, Sunderland do a lot of traditional scouting. This was something that Stuart Harvey did a hell of a lot of. He was constantly on the road, constantly abroad, not just watching players in the flesh to get that feel for it, but also building connections. It's an absolutely fantastic way to meet people, build networks, build connections with the clubs, with agents, with the players, maybe even the players' families. And those connections can be really powerful moving forward if you decide you want to move on a player. So that's a really important part of the process, is having this constant database of footballers who you think potentially, if they come available, could be perfect for your squad. And data is a really important part of that. Some of that is in-house. Sunderland do their own data work. They have a head of analysis and insights. That's really important. You can also, like Sunderland, like an awful lot of clubs, this is something that professional kind of top tier clubs do more and more now. It's quite often in partnership with third parties. So you'll have partners who have huge databases that you can use them. You can go to them with a player, or you can go and use their database to try and get a huge amount of information in a very short space of time. So that kind of works in conjunction really in terms of the in-house and the external thing. But this really is a 12-month process. As I said, Stuart Harvey was kind of the main driver of this when he was at the football club. That will, I'm pretty sure, will be Florent Gasolfi moving forward. I wouldn't be surprised if he made some of his own appointments to kind of help with that work. But that's kind of the long-term work that goes on now behind the scenes. Very different really to, say, the League One era, when, to be brutally honest, the scouting department, the recruitment department was tiny. It was probably based a lot more on contacts, which is still really important to be fair to Sunderland now, but there's a lot more kind of science and a lot more day-to-day work goes on outside of the transfer windows. And I think the Siddiqui deal is a perfect example of that bearing fruit, if you like, a player who Sunderland has been tracking for a long time. They were able to move quickly to beat the competition, already had a really good understanding, and you could see pretty much from day one of the season what a perfect signing it was, not just for the Premier League, but for Sunderland's style. Moving forward, so this is something that will be happening this month, I suspect, during the international break. As the window approaches, what you then have is Sunderland have a squad audit. So this is the point at which all that work which the recruitment staff has been doing starts to fold into the specifics of looking forward to the next transfer window, which obviously in this case will be the January window. So the squad audits are the point at which Régis Lebris and the coaching staff join the process in a significant way. So Sunderland will hold meetings, recruitment staff, coaching staff, obviously Christian Speakman and Florent Gasolfi will be a huge part of this. And they'll just talk about the squad what areas do we feel we need? And that'll be very obvious short-term stuff. If we've got a part of the pitch where we have a huge amount of injuries that aren't going to clear anytime soon, and therefore we might need a short-term solution. Is there a part of the pitch where, excuse me, that was unfortunate. Is there a part of the pitch where we need a longer-term solution? What are our priorities for this window? And it's at that point that you begin to drill down into what you actually need to do in the upcoming transfer window. It's not always just a short-term thing either in terms of what position do we do now. A big part of these squad audit meetings is actually to try and throw it a little bit further down the track as well. So for example, if you have a player who is in the team at the moment, but their contract's winding down, for example, you might be starting to look at, can we get a successor in the building before we lose this player? So I think the best example I can give of this one is, to be honest, on the whole, it was a January transfer window that was very unsuccessful during the end of Tony Mowbray, and obviously the window actually happened during Michael Beale's tenure when Sunderland really needed extra firepower up front and they didn't get it, and that obviously proved to be really costly. But going into that window, left wing was the one position on the pitch where they didn't have a short-term need because Jack Clarke was one of the best players in the division. But what Sunderland obviously knew at that stage was that Jack Clarke's contract was slowly beginning to wind down. There was no sign of a resolution, and they got an unexpected opportunity to sign Romain Mundle, who was a player who they'd been tracking for a long time, had tried to sign, but he initially decided to go to Belgium, and when he became available, they were able to move. A, because of the background work they'd already done, B, because of the financial position they were in, and this is obviously a really important part of the story in terms of trying to be financially prudent so you can kind of move when unexpected opportunities come, and maybe that's something that your rivals can't do if they have bigger PSR concerns, or if they have a higher wage bill, etc., that they're not able to be as flexible. Siddiqui, another example of that, where Sunderland were able to gazump their rivals really quickly for that signature. So that squad audit's a really important process, as I say, not just in terms of saying, hang on, all three of our left backs are injured, we need to get one in for the rest of the season or for next season, whether it's a summer or a January window, but also trying to look into some of those kind of longer term things, and all kinds of conversations can come into that. It might be outgoings as well. It might be a young player who's knocking on the door, but you don't quite think he's going to get the minutes he needs, and therefore you start talking about loan moves. So that kind of squad audit, it's a really important part, and what follows from that is that the recruitment staff will then, at this stage, have their names of players that obviously that they've been scouting. So for example, moving in this January window, I've got absolutely no doubt at all that Gisolfi will have players who's been looking at, who's been doing background work on. And what will then happen is they'll start to have discussions around those players, and the process will basically start. Lebris will then get sent loads of clips of these players. He'll then feed back his own thoughts, some players that he might think, yeah, that's perfect. Some players he might not be so sure about. And by the time January comes around, you're kind of in a position where hopefully you know which positions you're going for, and broadly speaking, which players are you going for. I'm just going to have a sip of my coffee. And then, of course, once you reach that point and the window opens, that's when you start the work of negotiating, trying to entice players. And this is a really important part of the process. And this is something where I'm sure a lot of football clubs do it, but obviously I can only speak from a Sunderland perspective. Something that I was able to see in the summer, and it's a really, really cool thing that the Sunderland did. I think it was the media team actually who came up with the video, but when Sunderland were starting the process of speaking to a player to convince them of the move, what they did was they designed this little, about 3 minutes long, basically like a hype video, really snappy footage of the coaches arriving for the playoff games, with the flares and the fans, footage of the goals in the playoffs. So obviously Dan Ballard's unbelievable strikes and the limbs that followed, really high octane, showing the kind of the impact that those goals had. Basically trying to build this really quick but persuasive narrative of Sunderland's story, of this team that kind of is coming back from its from the bottom, if you like. Obviously, most players have seen the Sunderland Till I Died documentary, and the video really taps into this like comeback story and this feeling that Sunderland is the place to be right now. And I think it's a really cool video, and it's basically just to try and give players a little bit of a snapshot of what they're sort of coming into in the project. Hopefully, what that video does is it gets the players' attention, and then you move into a much more traditional kind of flow, if you like, whereby the club will then have everyone in the kind of recruitment process has their role. So the players will be presented to. Some of that will be the facilities. That can be done sometimes in person. A player and their agent might come for a look around the academy. Like, it might be done virtually. Obviously, Zooms, obviously, as you would expect, as it is in all of our lives, a really important part of this these days. They'll talk about the development, so the facilities that Sunderland have, also how they can develop players, what the schedule looks like, all these kind of things, getting a bit more into the detail of what will actually be like to be a Sunderland player. At this point, really important as well, there'll also be a conversation with Régis Lebris. So he will come at this stage and he'll talk to the player about the team, how it's set up, the dressing room environment, more specifically where you can see that player fitting in, what their role might be. And hopefully by the end of that process, you've convinced the player that Sunderland is the place to be. Now, this was really difficult in the summer, as you can imagine, because players were looking at the promoted clubs, and I'm absolutely sure that Leeds and Burnley will have found the same thing and said, look, great project, great facilities, great fan base, great stadium, but I'm concerned that Sunderland are going to be going straight back down. So selling the players on the ambition that they were really going to have a go at this summer was a massive part of Sunderland's task, to show them this time it was going to be different. And I know for a fact that the Granit Xhaka signing was a massive moment in Sunderland's summer. Yes, they'd brought in some really good players and they'd convinced them of the project before that, but I know for a fact that that was a big moment in the summer in terms of maybe some more experienced, established players showing it was the most obvious way that Sunderland could demonstrate that they had a real shot of staying up and that they were really serious and ambitious about this project. And I know that that was a really big factor in the business Sunderland were able to do. So that was particularly this summer, that convincing players was a really important part of it. And I think Sunderland seemed to have got a nice balance between convincing players it was the right place to be, but also making sure players were coming for the right reasons as well. And I think you can see that in the attitude they've had. No mean feat, that. And I think something that Sunderland have done quite successfully. I think one of the final points I'll make is, I'm conscious, I feel like I've been talking for ages already, is one of the big things that Sunderland feel that they're really good at is being quite agile. So as I say, there is a structure in terms of how they want to speak to a player who does what in that role. But Sunderland will try and be flexible, and ultimately they want to lean on the contacts of whoever they can within the club to get a deal done. So for example, Joe Bellingham signing for the club, Christian Speakman has an absolutely huge part in that. Maybe his role in that particular deal would be bigger than it would be in others because he's got those relationships. Régis Lebris obviously was an absolutely massive part of the Enzo Lefebvre deal and was much more involved than that than he would be in a lot of other deals. Wilson Isidor's the same because of that connection he already had, having spoken to Isidore when he nearly signed for him at Lorient. The Granit Xhaka deal, everybody at Sunderland will tell you that was something that Kirill really led on. And once Sunderland had decided that Xhaka was the right player for them, which I imagine was a very short meeting because he's, as we've all seen, he's a pretty incredible player. But very much Kirill led that process of selling the project to him and sort of getting him interested. And I think that's something that Sunderland feel they do quite well, is being really agile. As I say, it's not about the try, or easy to say in practice, I guess, but try and keep the egos out of it, and whoever they can kind of lean on to get the deal done, they'll do so. And I think that's something that they've had a lot of success with over the last 18 months. Something I've talked about before, but Régis Lebris definitely enjoys a real prominence in this process. As I say, generally speaking, still comes in towards the end, but I think maybe some lessons have been learned from some of the kind of friction of the past, if you like. And I know that Lebris is a really kind of powerful voice in this whole process. So yeah, if the player wants to come, you've done all your work, and then it's about obviously getting the right deal, the kind of the boring side, I guess, negotiating the financials with the club, negotiating the financials with the player. And then moving forward is kind of the medical, getting them sorted. Sunderland obviously have staff who play a really important part in helping the players get settled, getting their living arrangements for their families, and all those kinds of things. So yeah, I've been speaking for about 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and wrap it up. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into how it actually works. And hopefully what I've tried to do as well is give you a little bit of an insight into how Sunderland have tried to kind of leverage this position they have. Is I think Sunderland is seen to neutrals and outsiders as a really cool football club at the moment, and I think that's something that Sunderland have really tried to lean into this summer. Obviously there's the really important thing in terms of the development that they offer and the fact that they feel they can better players basically and further their careers. That's obviously the number one thing, but also, as I say, getting players hyped to be part of this project, if you like, is something that they've done really well. And it's going to be really interesting to see how the recruitment department evolves. As I said, it's something that although, previously Christian Speakman would have been ultimately responsible for recruitment, it was being driven on a day-to-day basis by Stuart Harvey. That's clearly now going to be Florent Gasolfi, and it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. I anticipate there'll be further appointments because I think that work, that day-to-day work that goes on outside the transfer window is going to have to grow really, because Sunderland are going to have to be looking for every margin they can to get one over their rivals. So that's something I wouldn't be surprised if we see more movement on in future. And yeah, as I said, a really interesting point at the moment, because Sunderland this month, I expect the meetings will start over the November international break. We'll start going into that squad audit phase where they begin to talk about which positions they need in the window. And at that point, it'll be the case of feeding the players to the staff, to Lebris, who'll start watching those clips, giving their own impact, giving their own input. And then we'll see kind of how that all shakes out in January. It's going to be a really interesting window. I don't think, clearly it's not going to be anywhere near the same scale as the summer window just gone. But I think the early indications are that while it's going to be relatively limited, probably in terms of numbers, Sunderland are looking to strengthen and are looking to build on what they've got rather than settle. So it could be a really interesting prospect in store. And I can't wait to see which players we're going to be talking about, and hopefully I'll be able to bring you a few more of those on the whistle transfer specials. So that's it for this week's midweek edition of On the Whistle. I'll be back obviously with a normal episode after the Arsenal games. Keep an eye out for my call for questions after the game on X and on Blue Sky. And I'll see you as well after that, and then hopefully for another midweek special next week. Thanks so much for watching.